Okay. I think this is our third one for this year, and this is something new we're trying, breaking out the presentations from what would normally happen in a quarterly meeting in person. We've now moved it onto Zoom, and we'll see in the future if we keep doing it this way. Obviously, there's a bigger audience because we're reaching across the country and maybe sometimes even as far as Australia. So today we have Brad Bennett, and his presentation is Empathy in Haiku. Let me tell a little bit about Brad. Brad has published 2 collections of haiku, A Drop of Pond, which won a Touchstone Award, and A Turn in the River, which was shortlisted for the Touchstone Award. He is assistant editor for Haiku and Sinru for Frog Pond. During the pandemic, he has been teaching haiku classes to adults via Zoom and leading mass haiku walks in local parks and conservation areas. So Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Sue, could you make me co-host so I can show my slideshow?
I just clicked on multiple participants can share. Does that work?
Let me see. It looks like it will, yeah. So I will try that. Okay. Well, thank you, Gary and Sue and everybody else for inviting me to present today on euphony in haiku. I'm very honored to share my thoughts with so many wonderful haiku poets. I gave a presentation about this topic at the Seebeck Getaway in the fall of 2020, but since then I've continued to examine how we create euphony in haiku. So this presentation includes fresh ideas, further elucidation, and many new example poems. So if you were with me for that other presentation, hopefully you won't get too bored. And I'm going to start by taking a look at the agenda. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can everybody see that? Great. All right. So here's what I'm thinking of talking about today. After a bit of an introduction, I'm going to get into some traditional poetic sound devices that all poets use, and haiku poets have been a little leery of using: rhyme, alliteration, consonance, assonance, and onomatopoeia. Then I'm going to examine some other poetic sound devices that have kind of been coming to me as I examine some of my favorite euphonic haiku. And I'm calling these intra-line unity, euphonic contrast, completing the circle, mashup, moonlighting, shadow words, nesting dolls, and anagrams. Now, I want to start off by asserting that in haiku, the moment reigns supreme. Recording the moment and its sensory experiences, I think, should be the main endeavor in haiku. It's always been the main focus for me. But the haiku, of course, is a poem. So poems are designed to be read aloud. And when we listen to a poem, we're attracted to its pleasing sounds and how they can create unity in the poem. Something coheres. So as haiku poets, I think we need to think about how our poems sound in addition to whether we've captured that haiku moment adequately. And sometimes the sounds of words in the poem can also add to the meaning or emotional resonance of the haiku. So if we're able to stay true to the haiku moment and also choose words that with sounds that enhance the euphony, create more unity, and add to the meaning or emotional resonance of the poem, then we're getting the most out of our poems. So I was inspired by this to do this deep dive into euphony by 2 experiences. One was I read an excellent essay by Pamela Miller-Ness in Modern Haiku called The Poet's Toolbox, Prosody in Haiku. She wrote about how sound can enhance a haiku's meaning and impact its emotional resonance. When used with precision and subtlety, the elements of prosody, such as meter, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, enjambment, and repetition can add to the musical enjoyment of the haiku while simultaneously extending the meaning and expanding the emotional resonance. Second, I reread Peggy Willis Lyles's book, To Hear the Rain, and Lyles was an expert at euphony. As Alan Burns writes in his introductory notes to Lyles in his anthology, Where the River Goes, he says, few haiku poets have attended so skillfully to sound as Lyles did in her finely crafted poetry. And as Lyles herself writes in the preface of To Hear the Rain, sound enhances meaning. Every nuance contributes to the total effect. So I'm going to start by sharing 3 of Lyles's haiku to exhibit some of this wonderful euphony. The first was highlighted by Scott Mason in his talk on her at HNA 2019. The turning tide at standstill, sandhill cranes. I'm drawn to the repetition and alliteration of the T and S sounds in this poem. And then while pronouncing the near rhymes of standstill and sandhill with the cut in between, it makes me pause, just like the moment before the wave crawls back to the beach. The turning tide at standstill, sandhill cranes. The next 2 of hers are from her book, To Hear the Rain. Sun shower, the river otter somersaults. Here we have the alliteration of S sounds on the first and third lines. We also hear R-controlled syllables in river, otter, and shower. And I think all of those help create unity in this poem. In addition, all of the S's and R's remind me of an otter kind of undulating across the river. Cedar shavings, the carpenter's magnet snaps up tacks. Here, the soft C and SH sounds on the first line help to make that line sound soft and curly, kind of like those cedar shavings. Then the closed 1-syllable words with assonance on the last line make that line sound sharp and hard to produce a really nice contrast between these 2 parts. So if we agree that these 3 poems sound great, that leads us to our first question: what is euphony? The definition of euphony that I like, believe it or not, is from the Google Dictionary. And it's the second part of this. The quality of being pleasing to the ear, especially through a harmonious combination of words. The tendency to make a phonetic change for ease of pronunciation. I like the second one because it implies an active effort to create sound harmony. We can create euphony mindfully in our haiku. So let's look specifically at haiku. What's euphony in haiku? You know those moments when you read a haiku and immediately feel that it sounds right, but can't quite put your finger on why until you read it again and again and you study it? I think sometimes we respond positively to a haiku on an unconscious level when its words elicit euphony. The poem sounds good in a musical way and hence feels unified. And I think, as Ness claims in her essay, that there are 4 major ways that euphony can benefit our poems. 1, it helps to create music. 2, it can extend the meaning of the haiku. 3, it can expand the emotional resonance. And then 4, it can create unity within the haiku. And poetic euphony can be created in a variety of ways. One way poets added euphony to their poems is by using more traditional phonetic or phonemic devices like rhyme, alliteration, consonance, assonance, and onomatopoeia. We can also play with meter, rhythm, enjambment, repetition, and other techniques, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the phonemic devices, the sounds, the ones that play with the individual sounds that make up words, and not with meter and rhythm. And I think these sounds are referred to as phonemes which are the smallest units of speech sound that distinguish one word from another. There are 44 of them in the English language. Now, I've taught phonics to third graders for many years, but I'm not going to bore you with the list. But know that they are created by consonant sounds, vowel sounds, and then combinations of the two. So first, we're going to take a closer look at how we can use these traditional phonemic devices successfully. And I'm going to talk about 5 of them: rhyme, alliteration, consonance, assonance, and onomatopoeia. Historically, we haikuists have eschewed these poetic devices of rhyme, of these 5, and for some very good reasons. Using them overtly can feel heavy-handed, or too clever, too contrived, too cute, or too poetic. But most importantly, they can distract from the haiku moment or from the poem itself. But if we use them carefully and deftly, we can create some mighty fine music. Lee Gerga, who's with us today, says in his book, Haiku, A Poet's Guide, the judicious use of oral devices in haiku can help focus the reader and listener's attention on the important aspects of the verse. Overdoing, of course, can spoil a haiku. The brief, fragile haiku is easily overwhelmed by use of powerful sounds and sound associations. The approach of the haiku poet to this problem, as to everything, requires lightness and balance. So if we act with lightness and balance, as Lee suggests, these poetic devices can work. And as Ness asserts in her article, I suggest that we should actively utilize all of the musical devices available in our poets' toolboxes, though perhaps with a lighter touch, given the brevity and fragility of haiku. So first, let's consider rhyme. In English, it's rarer to rhyme than it is in Japanese, because in Japanese, a lot of the words do rhyme. So in English, rhymes really stick out in haiku, especially end rhymes. Jane Reichold, in Writing and Enjoying Haiku, writes, in Japanese, due to the constructive use of vowels in the language, one has a 1 in 6 chance that any 2 lines will rhyme. Thus, the Japanese haiku often have not only a line end rhyme, but often 1 or more internal rhymes. The writers use this ability to strengthen their poems. We can do the same thing in English. But if rhyming works, especially internal and near rhymes, they need to be done really subtly. As Jim Kasian says in his article, The Use of Language in Haiku, internal and off rhyme is a bit easier to accommodate as opposed to end rhyme, it being less powerful and final. And a good rule of thumb is to allow rhyme or off rhyme to stand in a poem if it comes to the poem unbidden and does not overpower the other elements in the poem. So let's look at some rhyming. First, let's look at some end rhyme. An end rhyme are rhymes at the end of lines, obviously. Summer night, we turn out all the lights to hear the rain. So with a lighter touch, the end rhymes can work. And here we have the words night and lights, which are near rhymes. And making one of those end words plural tweaks the poem so that the end rhyme doesn't sound so sing-songy. So that's one thing that I think works with the end rhyme. Also, the end rhymes in the first 2 lines of this poem tie them together so that the third line stands out, which is, I think, what she intended. Ness also notes that end rhyme can be used if the lines have different meters. Spring rain, the measured step of a sandhill crane. This poem has end rhymes in lines 1 and 3, but it's not heavy-handed at all, in part because the words before the rhyming words are accented differently. So in line 1, spring rain is equally accented, spring rain. In line 3, the word sandhill is a trochee, where the first syllable is accented and then the second one is unaccented. So sandhill crane has a different measure than spring rain, a different accent. So I think that's why it works well in this poem. Now let's talk about internal rhyme. According to Ness, an internal rhyme can help to unify ideas within a poem. Morning stillness, what's left of the mist shines in the pines. Here we have the internal rhyme of shines and pines. And again, it works because it just kind of makes sense for the poem, I think. Lifting fog, every leaf tip drips sunlight. So we have the near rhymes, the internal rhymes of tip and drips to repeat or replicate the sound of the fog dripping. And we can also talk about internal rhyme that happens successfully on different lines and in different positions in those lines. Through the chains of a child's swing, spring starts. So the rhyme of swing at the end of line 2 and spring at the beginning of line 3, to me, recreate the swinging action of the poem, swing and spring. Sometimes a word can rhyme with a part of another word to create some euphony and unity. Sunlight fills the millstone's furrows, a pine warbler's trill. Now you might be surprised, as I was, that we have fills, mill, and trill in this, and it didn't like hit me in the face right away because there are 3 different ways of going about this rhyme. You have the S on the end of fill, you have trill with no S, then millstone is part of a larger word. So this poem combines several of the rhyming techniques that I've talked about so far. Internal rhymes with and without an S on the end on different lines, and also as part of longer words. Very deft. Now let's talk about near rhyme. Near rhyme is also referred to as off, slant, imperfect, or approximate rhyme. And as noted, it's less intrusive and can be very effective. Ness claims that you can create a sense of unity and closure to a poem without the heaviness and possible sing-song quality of pure end rhyme. Alone, not alone, a loon in still water. So the word alone in here is very close to the words a loon. And those, plus the repetition of the word alone, create an echo effect like the sound of a loon's call. I think the sounds also add to the emotional resonance of the poem. Here's another one. Winter forest, the mist from a whisper. The words winter and whisper are near rhymes. And then you have the ending of forest and the beginning of winter that connect with some of these words as well. Flowering laurel, the hedge trimmer lowering the sky. Here we have the words flowering, lowering, and laurel, all of which are pretty close to each other, and I think they bind the poem together. Now let's talk about alliteration, which is the repetition at close interval of initial consonant sounds. Kenneth Yasuda, in his book, The Japanese Haiku, writes, alliteration speaks gently where rhyme commands. But I would also add that alliteration should also be used sparingly. David Grayson, in an essay called Word Choice in English Language Haiku, The Uses of Roots, writes that Anglo-Saxon words lend themselves to alliteration. So I was talking with Chuck Brickley, who's also with us today, about sounds in haiku, and he recommended that I take a look at a book called Sound and Sense: An Introduction to Poetry by Lawrence Perrine and Thomas R. Arp. I think it's a book that's used in a lot of college classes. And I found something really interesting in there. They state that in addition to onomatopoeic, I'm sorry, this is what I just read recently. In addition to onomatopoetic words, there's another group of words, sometimes called phonetic intensives, whose sound, by a process as yet obscure, to some degree connects to their meaning. I like this idea of obscure, kind of unconscious meaning happening behind the curtain here. So here are some examples. So if you have words that start with an initial ST sound, it connotes strength, like words like steel, sturdy, strong. Initial SL sounds give us things that are smooth and wet, slick, slime, slosh. Long O or OO sounds are melancholy or full of sorrow, like moan, mourn, gloom. Medial ATT sounds, act sounds, give us some movement, like spatter, clatter, rattle. And then final hard C or CK sounds give us the sudden cessation of movement, like crack, peck, flick. And these intrinsic relationships of phonemes work, I think, at a gut level. It's intriguing to think that the sounds of words have meanings and not just the whole words. And I think phonetic intensives are really at play in many haiku. Here's some that utilize some of these intensives. The same granite in a styles step, village graveyard. So here, the initial ST sounds in styles and step infer strength. And you can't get much stronger than a piece of granite. Whoops, sorry. Daylight moon, the slicked down reeds of a muskrat slide. So the initial SL sounds connote smoothness and wetness. Now, alliteration is commonly used to mimic sounds. Here's an example. First frost, the echo of the caw of the crow. So here, the repeated hard C sounds of echo, caw, and crow mimic the call of the crow. And the word crow is a close echo of the sound of a caw. Alliteration can also emphasize quantity, like the number of leaves. Light on the pile, last autumn leaf. So this poem is a pile of L sounds. I wonder if we can take a dive into that pile. Life alone, licking the ladle. Here we have the same L sounds, but this time they connote the repeated licking of a ladle. There's also an intriguing paradox here between the solitude of living alone and the crowd of L sounds. Alliteration can also work more effectively if there are other words in between the words with alliterative sounds. A change in their voices, children finding a fledgling. So we have the CH sounds on lines 1 and 2, the F sounds on lines 2 and 3, and they help create some unity. But the alliteration words are not back to back. There are words in between that prevent it from being too heavy-handed. Kenneth Yasuda, again, in his book, talks about what he calls oblique alliteration, which is the repetition of the same initial consonant sound followed by a different consonant sound. And this can be created most often with consonant blends, like words that start with S, but you can start with SM, ST, SP, etc. He claims that you can use oblique alliteration to produce similarity instead of exactness. Sleet storm, the bare tree branches glisten with grackles. So here we have SL on line 1, ST on line 2, GL on line 2, and GR on line 3. Yasuda also discussed what he calls crossed alliteration, and this is more complex. This happens when sets of alliteration alternate, kind of like a chain. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I was going to show you the different consonant blends on that last one. A beer can, for comparison, bear paw print. So here we have beer and bear and can and comparison, but they alternate like links in a chain. Billowing clouds, a spittlebug claims the daisy stem. Here we have three sets, billowing and bug, clouds and claims, spittle and stem. So three links in this chain. Now let's take a look at consonance, which is the repetition of consonant sounds in the middle or end positions, as opposed to alliteration. Lee Gerga states that consonance is less dominating than alliteration, and I agree with them. It's definitely more subtle. Still wet, the gravestones sparkle grackles. This is an example of media consonants, or medial, sorry. The K sounds in the middle of sparkle and grackle help to unify this poem. Last light, black ducks forage for acorns. This poem includes N consonants, the CK at the end of ducks and black. If you remember, these phonetic intensives of the CK at the end suggest quick movement, like the ducks looking for acorns or jabbing at them to try to pick them up. Well water, I hesitate to stir the stars. In this poem, we have what are called R-controlled vowels in water, stir, and stars. And I see multiple R-controlled vowel syllables often in haiku. It's something that I actually use sometimes myself for different reasons. There are a lot of words that end with vowels and R's. New moon, the night watchman goes unseen. Here, the repeated ending N sounds remind me of the rounds of the watchman. So the consonants adds to the meaning of this poem. Dusk to darkness, meadow to wood. Now this one does something very intriguing that I want to show you. Here we have the initial D sound in the first two lines, where D is at the beginning of the words. So that's initial alliteration. But then we move to the medial of meadow and the end or terminal of wood. So the D transforms from the beginning to the middle to the end, kind of like, for me, what looks like the transition from day to night. Now let's take a look at assonance. And Ness calls assonance vowel rhyme, or the repetition at close interval of vowel sounds, initial or internal. And Lee writes that assonance is usually least obtrusive of oral devices. I think assonance is perhaps the most effective sound unifier in haiku. Jet lag, a tea bag steeping in tepid water. Here we hear the short E in jet and tepid, and the long E in tea and steeping. And in addition, we hear the internal rhyme of lag and bag. Spring equinox, the cyclist's thighs scissoring light. Here we have the alternating short and long I sounds on all three lines. And for me, it's like the cyclist's thighs pedaling up and down, short and long. Now let's take a look at onomatopoeia. And that's when a word through its sound as well as its sense, represents what it defines. Higginson, in the Haiku Handbook, claimed that onomatopoeia grammatically unifies a poem. I found that many names of entities that make sounds like instruments or birds are pretty onomatopoetic, and they are welcome in haiku. Tent, the timpani of rain. Here, the name of a musical instrument is onomatopoetic, and then Jim threw in a few more T sounds to emphasize the beat of the timpani. A peewee keeps calling the deep roots of weeds. The peewee bird is named for its call, and Burns helps to repeat that call with the assonance of the long E sounds in keeps, deep, and weeds. So we've seen that traditional poetic sound devices can be used successfully in haiku, and I've been thinking about euphony and haiku and noticed some other ways that sound can be effective. Peggy Willis Lyles, in her preface again to her book, says, one characteristic of all poetry is careful diction with close attention to the denotations, connotations, and associative possibilities of words. So here's what I came up with. Intra-line unity, euphonic contrast, completing the circle, mashup, moonlighting, shadow words, nesting dolls, and anagrams. Sometimes, well, I'm going to start with intra-line unity. Sometimes each line in a haiku has its own euphonic thread. Take a look at this one. Patio Tai Chi, a hummingbird's quick sip at the coral bells. So each line in this poem is unified by its own euphony. In line 1, we have the T sounds and the long E sounds, even though they're not made with E's. In line 2, we have the closed syllable words at the end of quick and sip. And then in line 3, we hear the consonants of coral and bells. Sometimes in euphonic contrast, my next element, 2 lines in a haiku share a common euphonic thread, and a third line does not. And this creates a juxtaposition of sound and mood. It could be that the last line is different, as in this poem. Death notice, daylilies divided for another garden. So the first 2 lines of this poem and the original garden are full of D sounds, daylilies. The third line does not contain that D sound, so it sets apart from the first 2 lines. But hopefully the second garden and third line will be receiving some daylilies and some D sounds soon as they get replanted. Sometimes the line that creates euphonic contrast is the first one. Honeysuckle, we open jelly jars for fireflies. So the first line here is the only one without alliteration. We get the alliteration in line 2 and then a different alliteration in line 3. So the next element I want to talk about, I'm calling completing the circle. And this is one of my favorites. Sometimes the reason the poem feels unified is because, in fact, it has been deliberately unified by using near rhymes in the first and last words of the poem. The circle gets completed. And for me, this can be very emotionally satisfying. Last year's hostas, our losses, turned to lace. The near rhymes of the word last and the word lace allude to the cycles of growth during the year. So they not only complete the circle, but they allude to the circles, the cycles. This one also includes the near rhymes hostas and losses to add to the poem's unity and resonance. Worm moon, the owl's small body still warm. Again, the near rhymes in this sad poem of worm and warm allude to the cycles of birth and death. Lilac petals, the wind turns italic. In this poem, lilac and italic are near rhymes, and I think it's the wind blowing the letters around in the word lilac to form the new word italic. Now let's look at what I call mashup. A couple of years ago, I started to notice a writing process that I was engaging in, first unconsciously and then more deliberately. As I was walking and writing, I was coming up with one part of the haiku in my mind, usually the phrase, and then I would let its sounds in an almost instinctual way lead me to associative sounds for the fragment. I would repeat the phrase in my head out loud, listening to its sounds and shuffling them around and seeing what emerges. Maybe some of you musicians know more about this than I do, but it feels like creating a mashup song. And here's my example. Waxing moon, fiddler crabs mob the mudflats. So I wrote this one while visiting Cape Cod, and I was looking for the perfect verb to describe the movement of the crabs. I was considering crawl and a few other verbs, and then I just kept repeating the words in the poem over to myself. And somehow the B of crab and the M of mud made me think of the word mob. And I thought it fit well with the meaning as well as the euphony and the unity. The next one I want to talk about, I'm calling moonlighting. We all know that a word in a haiku can do more than one job. And perhaps helping to depict the haiku moment is that word's day job. But that same word can also moonlight. It can pick up other jobs, which can add euphony or emotional resonance. Often there's one important word in a haiku that is doing some of this moonlighting. Let's look at two examples. A jay stuffs more seeds into its esophagus, last days of summer. In my first draft of this poem, I used the word crop, which I thought was the accurate word to use, but I didn't like the sound of it. So I did some research online and found out that it's not actually a crop that the jay uses to store seeds. It's part of its esophagus. So this was kind of a happy serendipity. The word esophagus was not only the accurate word, but it also gave me two more S sounds and another F sound to tie in with the other sounds in the poem and create some unity. I also imagine that the long word esophagus stored some of the extra S's, kind of like the J storing seeds. So the word esophagus did several jobs for me in this poem. Here's another example. Street bazaar, the wind lifts a tune from a terracotta pot. Now, I don't know the history of how Allen constructed this poem, but he could have used many different descriptors for the word pot. The word terracotta sounds like a tune the wind might make blowing into or over a pot, kind of onomatopoeic. So it serves several purposes in this poem: descriptive, semantic, and euphonic. Now, the next element I'm going to talk about is I'm calling shadow words. And the term shadow word was coined by Kristen Lindquist during a conversation we had while we were workshopping together. When we read a haiku, we make connections to memories, emotions, and knowledge. It's kind of like linking and shifting, right, with haiku forms. We might also make connections to other words that are not in the haiku. I've noticed that occasionally a word in a haiku makes me think of another one that's not actually there. The first word and its context can lead us to another word that might sound similar, that's not actually in the poem. And I believe this can happen kind of consciously or unconsciously. So let's look at some shadow words. Soft serve at the wharf. A sloop coming in on evening wind. Now, this poem works really well by itself, but for me, the word sloop and the fact that we're being treated to ice cream at the wharf reminds me of the word scoop. For some reason, the word scoop came into my mind. Now, I didn't think of this during my first reading, but when I read it the second and third time, I felt like it came out and it helped create some intriguing cross unity in there. So when I took a closer look, I saw that connection. Here's another example. Spring stroll, we name all the greens we remember. So the word stroll made me think of the word scroll, in part because I was picturing listing the names of all the greens from the Crayola box of crayons, right? So it's kind of a list on a scroll. So that's why scroll came to me. April drizzle, the long wait for fried clams. In this poem, the word drizzle and the sound of the clams frying in the oil reminded me of the word sizzle. Now, I don't think Jim and Hannah deliberately included certain words to trigger these other words that came to my mind. But I do think you can deliberately do that yourself. So I deliberately created a situation in this poem where another word could emerge in a reader's mind. And I'd be curious to see if this happened for other people. Creek trickle, a chickadee lands on my hand. Now I use the word trickle here in hopes that the word tickle might fly into the reader's mind. Perhaps like the bird's feet tickling my palm. So the next one I want to talk about, I'm calling nesting dolls, kind of like the Russian nesting dolls that many of us might have in our homes. And I'm calling this phenomenon nesting dolls because parts of words can nest or interact in interesting sound ways. You can use a word and then repeat it as a small part of another word or a syllable inside another word. And this repetition, I think, can create more euphony, unity, and resonance. Snow wind, wringing the tea bag until it tears. So not only do you get those great repeated T sounds in the last line, but in this poem, the word T is kind of nested in the word tear, even though they're two different vowel sounds. I think the alliteration of the words T and tear is very effective, especially with the other T's on the last line. And especially also since the second word is altered by just one letter. Perhaps like the tea bag being torn open to create the tea or to spill the tea. Now this one does something really interesting. A cold cup from a cold cupboard, morning sun. So you get the hard C's again and again, which for me add to the bitterness of the temperature. But the word cup is repeated, but the P sound gets lost in cupboard, even though cup is there. This one also feels like the cups are nested in the shelf, just like nesting dolls. Three tiny bones in my inner ear, meadowlark. So in this one, the word in is in line 2. Whoops, sorry. Sometimes they don't happen right away. The word in line 2 is also inside the word inner in line 2. How appropriate, right? It's all in. It's kind of like a spiral or a nautilus. But then we also see the letters I and N inside the word tiny in line 1, even though the vowel sounds change. So there's some kind of visual thing going on here as well as the oral. How intriguing. Okay, the last element I want to talk about, I'm calling anagrams. Some poets use some of the letters and sounds in a word or phrase from one line to create a related word with similar sounds in another line. The letters and sounds get rearranged in an anagramish way. Say that 10 times fast. Summer dusk, a duck's wake turns back the waves. So if you take the D, U, S, and K in the words on line 2, it creates the word dusk, which is already on line 1. So the second line gives us a new way to create dusk. Sunlit silt, the marsh rabbit's eyes. So if you rearrange some of the letters in sunlit, you get silt. So it becomes almost a near rhyme. So I'm going to end my presentation with one more poem and one more quote. First, awake, a lake of mist. Now this one does a lot, even with just 6 words. It creates sounds that remind me of concentric ripples, because first and mist are near rhymes, and awake and lake are internal rhymes. So it's almost like there are 2 circles in here. Plus, this poem utilizes the device I mentioned earlier called completing the circle. First and mist are near rhymes at the beginning, at the end of the poem. So thank you very much for examining euphony with me. I'd love to know what you think about this, especially if you thought of aspects that I haven't thought about yet. And there are so many concentric circles in the haiku community, like the concentric circles in this poem, and for which I am very grateful. Let's end with another great poem, or sorry, another great quote from Pamela Miller-Ness. We need to write with our ears as well as our eyes and minds. So thank you very much. And I'd love to hear what you think about all this. Thank you.
Very nicely done, Brad. Very nice. Have you published this anywhere?
Say that again?
Have you published this anywhere?
No, but I'm turning it into an article and I'm hoping that Modern Haiku will accept it.
That would be
So
great.
I'd love to know if people have comments about your poems or about any of the ideas that I've presented today. If you have examples of poems that you've written or other people have written with euphonic devices in them, I'd love to know about your experience too. Is this something that you actually think about ahead of time and do deliberately, or does it sometimes show up without you knowing it? So if you have something to say, why don't you either raise your hand physically or use the hand under, I think it's in reactions. And Sue and I will call on people and we'll see what you have to offer. Anybody want to start us off?
If you go ahead and wave like this, it'll be easier to see than the little raised hand. I see Faye.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, I'm writing haiku in the Japanese too, because Japanese have a kanji characters. So I thought like Japanese are more rich, kind of like a choice. And I've never thought about sounds, you're talking about, and it was almost give me a headache. But because
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's like a good headache, because for me, it's very difficult because maybe I cannot pronounce the word right. Like you mentioned somewhere, lilac and italic. And for me, it's like lilac and italic. I just read it immediately. So it's very interesting. And I've never think about a lot of those links. I forgot. you know, like a tear and the tears cup and cupboard. I mean, it's interesting. So maybe this week, under my headache mind, I may try to write a sound. But it's very educational. It is very difficult for me to master, but it's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And it is really fascinating to me because I think a lot of you are already doing this on either an unconscious or conscious level. And I think I don't notice it when I'm doing it sometimes until I reread the poem and think, oh, wait, that's why it's got that unification or connection going on. It's some of it's sound. It's not just meaning. I think John had his hand up.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Brad. I really enjoyed your talk. It kind of reminded me of, so I began writing poetry daily in my early teens, and my first definition of poetry was musical speech. So that fits perfectly with what you're presenting here. The other thing that I was thinking about is I did this without consulting with anybody, you know, for many years. I didn't go public with my poetry until I went to college for the most part. And I learned all these things that I presumed I'd invented. And then when I went public with my poetry, I found out other people had names for them.
So are there any names that I don't know yet?
Oh, I'm sure, but you know, there's names for everything. But what I wanted to say is, you know, I really enjoyed the terms you made up, you know, and it kind of made me think I might want to give that a try myself. It sounds like fun.
Well, I love your phrase of musical speech. I use several of your poems, John. Is this something that you think about deliberately while you're writing?
It's something that I think about after I've written. You know, in other words, I sort of start from inspiration, you know, and then I apply the craft. So a good part of the poem's already done before I pick up a pencil, you know. But once I pick up the pencil, yes, all this comes into play. One of the terms I remember that I made up for myself was refused rhyme, you know, which you know, now I know is something people do all the time. It's basically you lead people to a place where you would anticipate a rhyme, but you go somewhere else when you get there.
Oh, that's cool. I like that name.
Yeah, I forget what it's actually called, but you know, as for myself, when I thought I'd invented it, I called it refused rhyme.
Have you used it in a poem?
I've used it in a lot of poems. I think it's commonly used, you know.
Well, thank you.
Paul Geiger had his hand up. If you want to unmute first. Paul, you're muted. Can you, there you go.
No, I'm unmuted.
Start over.
Strunk White's little book, The Elements of Style. At the very end, he says something that ultimately, he says, it depends on your ear. Style depends on your ear, which I thought was really wonderful, because that's the way I try to go, because I listen. I'm the words, I hear the words. That's why I could never be a speed reader, because I seem to have to hear the words.
Do you think that's about voice as well?
I don't know, could be.
I think these techniques can help to kind of create a haiku writer's voice.
I like John Stevenson's remarks there about in college and doing these things, and oh, somebody gave a name to that.
I think I saw Patricia had her hand up earlier. Patricia, you're muted.
Well, thank you, Brad. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm a big believer in that sound is so important to our writing. And I remember taking a workshop from Jory Graham, and she said that sound is so important to the poet because it's the path to the unconscious.
Mm.
The sound takes us to our unconscious. So really important.
Mm.
And I like your lists very much. I have one to add to, and that's actually down to the letter, the form and the shape of the letters actually can add meaning to the poem. For instance, the letters W and Y and V have the shape of wings. So in many poems about birds, those letters can add to the actual motion or resonance, not even counting their sound.
I think you're right. In my original presentation, I had an example of that, actually. One of my
You did,
poems,
yes.
Turn After Turn, the Perpetual Surf. It's TERN, Turn After Turn, the Perpetual Surf. And I use those R's to represent the kind of waves about the.
Yes. Yep.
I think you're right. There's another element to it.
I'd very much like to have a copy of your talk. Hard copy or email or whatever.
Well, I'm hoping that the article that I turn this into gets published in Modern Haiku. So I would recommend that you subscribe to Modern Haiku, and it should be there, hopefully, in one of the future issues.
Oh, okay.
At least,
Yeah, great presentation. If Paul doesn't accept it for Modern Haiku, he needs to have his head examined. But I just wanted to make one comment. It's something that everyone else probably already noticed. But you had the, I'm looking back, the nesting, let's see, was it the nesting dolls?
Yeah.
And you had the shadow words and the nesting dolls, and the Robert Gilliland haiku, snow wind bringing the tea bag until it tears. Of course, the word tears can also be pronounced tears, which I think adds very nicely to the meaning of the poem.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I should have read it twice with both pronunciations. Cathabella?
With haiku being so short, I think it's a very audible kind of poem, especially in that the way John said, the poem is often finished in his head before he picks up a pencil or you put your hands on a keyboard, whatever you do, because it kind of sings inside your head before it's done. I always have that feeling in all different ways, on a walk or when I'm waking up or in the middle of the night, just something, you can hear a poem. So haiku is a wonderfully euphonic, you could say, poem in that way, of its own nature.
Do you ever use the phenomenon that I call mashup, Cathabella?
I don't think about it. That's the thing. It happens. Things happen. And then, like what John said, I would go back and maybe look at it and see what happens then. But I don't name them like or try to do it. I don't know if that's what you really asked. I forgot exactly what mashup was, but I saw it.
Well, for me, it's I kind of repeat the phrase in my head over and over again.
Yes.
In part to hear the music, which I think is what you're talking about.
Yes.
And then related words or related sounds kind of fall out of that process. So it's not fully conscious.
Yeah, with me, I almost avoid the consciousness of it till a lot later. But I don't try not to. It's just that the way I recognize my poetic voice, it talks to me or sings in a way, and then later I might say, "Oh, it's doing that," but I don't try to do it.
Yeah, I think some of this happens during the crafting phase, right? We get the poem down and then we craft it. And the challenge is to create something, to put a lot of work into a haiku to make it sound like you didn't put a lot of work into it.
Yes, thank you for what you're doing. I love that you're concentrating on sound this way.
Oh, thank you. Helen had her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say in what we're talking that I can't say that, well, I think that poets have a certain sensibility kind of built in to the auditory aspects of speech. So I think a lot of this does happen kind of unconsciously. But maybe when the conscious part comes in, as if you have something where you're almost there, but not quite. And then you start consciously applying some of these strategies. But I think to begin with, most, if not all, poets already have some kind of inbuilt sensibility to the sounds of the language and speech and the rhythm and all, and the meter and all of that.
I think you're right. I think a lot of this happens kind of instinctually.
Yeah, but it's really interesting and very helpful to see it spelled out the way you're doing, and it helps to make it a more conscious process when we do need to go to being more conscious about it. So this talk is extremely helpful. I heard your first talk as well. This one, you know, it wasn't repetitive in that sense. I could hear it again. I would like to hear it again, probably several times. Or if you get that article, I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Wakako?
Yes. Hi, Brad. Thank you so much. It was a really, really great presentation. I wrote the haiku before, and then after I heard your talk, and then I kind of wrote in chat. But my question is, when you revise the haiku, my original haiku was morning moon, cooing sounds of a road runner. And then after you sort of listen to your talk and said, is it better with the morning moon cooing calls of a road runner or something? Is it too much? How do you sort of, decide? Is it like personal sort of hearing? Is it comfortable to you to hear this way or that way? How should I edit?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think everybody has their own kind of ear, for haiku. So I think your haiku is very effective. And I think cooing calls sounds to me like you're replicating the actual calls of the roadrunner. So there's a lot of alliteration, but I think that's okay because you're trying to recreate that sound of the roadrunner. So it works for me.
Thank you.
So Sue, I don't know how much more time you want to devote to conversation.
If anyone has more questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll move on to announcements.
Like Michael,
One quick comment. I'm late, so I apologize if it might have been said, but I always think of Osho, who said 1,000 times on the tongue, meaning that one revises it by actually speaking the poem. I don't think you have to count 1,000 times, but that idea of what does the poem sound like, that is so important. And it's underappreciated in English language haiku.
Thank you.
Joseph, were you going to say something? Joseph or
I
Bennett?
just wanted to, while was speaking, I just kept thinking of Gerard Manley Hopkins and the play of language. And I rushed out and got a copy of The Wind over here. I just wanted to give you like the first 3 lines. If you're interested in every form that he's mentioned, this is your poet. This is from The Wind over. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's Dauphine, dapple dawn drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and so forth. Several stanzas. I mean, he carries you, and in this poem especially, you are just riding with the falcon, floating on the air. And that's all I wanted to do is comment that this is a prime example of where the meaning of the poem is not only enhanced by all of these things, but that's where most of the meaning rides, it seems to me.
Mm. Yeah, that poem is riding a surf of alliteration, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it? And then there's so many internal rhymes and what have you, and then all of the allusions. It's when you've had too much of modern poetry, especially free form, and go back to them and pick up the rhythm again.
Anybody else want to add anything? Oh.
Well, I
Baby,
just want to say thank you, Brad. That was just excellent. That's the third, at least, time I've heard it. And I agree with Helen. I could easily hear that again. So, so useful.
well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Very nice.
Thanks, Brad. That was very inspirational.